They said it only took one drop of blood to change the world. But no one asked what would happen if that drop was a lie. Silicon Valley had always loved its prophets, people who promised to reshape the future with nothing but conviction and charisma. In the early 2000s, one such prophet emerged, young, brilliant, and eerily self-assured. Her name was Elizabeth Holmes, and she wasn't selling code or hardware. She was selling hope, distilled into a single drop of blood. Holmes had the kind of presence that made people stop mid-sentence. Tall, statuesque, and almost spectral with her icy blue eyes and signature black turtleneck, she seemed cut from the same cloth as Steve Jobs. And that wasn't a coincidence. Jobs wasn't just her idol. He was her template. At 19 years old, Holmes dropped out of Stanford. She said she couldn't waste time learning about innovation when she could be out there creating it. Her professors thought it was reckless. Investors thought it was bold. Elizabeth called it destiny. And destiny, it seemed, was listening. Holmes founded Theranos, a name forged from the fusion of therapy and diagnosis. Her vision was simple but revolutionary. A world where a few drops of blood could run hundreds of tests, from cholesterol levels to cancer, without the pain of needles or the waiting game of traditional labs. "I want to make healthcare accessible to everyone," she said softly, her eyes glowing with conviction. No more fear, no more excuses. It was the kind of promise Silicon Valley lived for, audacious, emotional, and impossible to ignore. But behind that promise was something else, something quieter, darker. The seeds of deception were already taking root. In the early days, Holmes worked out of a small office in Palo Alto. She recruited young engineers from Stanford, brilliant minds eager to make history. Among them was Ramesh Sunny Balwani, a man 20 years her senior, seasoned in tech and power. He wasn't just an investor. He became her enforcer, and secretly, her lover. Together, they formed a kind of fortress around Theranos. Sunny was blunt, harsh, and unyielding, the muscle behind Holmes' mystique. He made sure no one asked the wrong questions. The company's first prototype, the Edison machine, looked sleek and futuristic. A small box that could supposedly analyze a patient's health with a single drop of blood. Investors were dazzled. Holmes toured boardrooms like a preacher with a miracle. She spoke softly, smiled rarely, and even seasoned billionaires leaned forward in awe. "It's not just a company," she would whisper. "It's a revolution." And money poured in like floodwater. Larry Ellison, Rupert Murdoch, the Walton family. Even Henry Kissinger and George Shultz joined the board. By 2014, Theranos was valued at over $9 billion. Holmes was declared the youngest self-made female billionaire in history. But inside the pristine glass walls of Theranos headquarters, something was off. The employees, those bright-eyed dreamers, began to notice the cracks. The Edison didn't work. It never had. The blood samples clotted. The results were inconsistent. Sometimes the machine didn't even turn on. But no one could say that out loud. Holmes demanded silence. Balwani demanded obedience. And the fear, it spread like infection. Employees who raised concerns found themselves isolated, dismissed, or escorted out. The truth became a dangerous thing, one that could cost you your job, your career, maybe even your sanity. At Theranos, one former engineer later said, "The biggest lie wasn't what we told investors. It was what we told ourselves." But one person, A quiet, observant biochemist was about to stumble upon something inside that lab, something that would change everything. Inside Theranos' Palo Alto headquarters, the dream was beginning to rot. Quietly, beautifully, from the inside out. Every morning, young engineers and lab technicians walked through glass doors with the company's mission statement printed above them. One tiny drop changes everything. But what it didn't say was that inside those walls, truth itself was being diluted, drop by drop. The illusion of innovation. The Edison machine, the little great box Holmes had paraded before investors, didn't work, not the way she claimed. It could handle only a fraction of the tests promised. Even then, the results were wildly unreliable. Yet every time a potential partner came for a demo, be it a Walgreens executive or a military official, Holmes made sure the show went on. In one presentation, an assistant pricked a volunteer's finger. The blood sample went into the Edison. Holmes smiled serenely as the machine buzzed. But what the visitors didn't know was that the sample had been quietly taken out of the Edison, whisked to another lab down the hall where a commercial Siemens analyzer ran the test. Minutes later, Holmes presented the Edison's result. Perfect, precise, miraculous. Applause followed. Cameras flashed. No one asked for a second demonstration. "We didn't just fake the data," one former engineer confessed years later. "We faked reality." Theranos wasn't a tech company anymore. It was theater. By late 2013, the pressure was suffocating. Holmes wanted speed, secrecy, and control. Sunny Balwani wanted obedience. Every floor had surveillance cameras. Every email was monitored. Employees were forbidden from discussing projects outside their immediate teams. Even asking questions became suspicious behavior. The company's internal motto? Do or die. Workers whispered about the ones who disappeared, fired overnight, their access cards revoked, their names erased from Slack channels. Even in the lab, scientists were being forced to make impossible compromises. Some diluted samples to make the results appear stable. Others manipulated data in PowerPoint slides before they reached Holmes's office. If you question the machine, you were questioning Elizabeth. And questioning Elizabeth meant you were the enemy. The emotional temperature rose daily. Tears were wiped discreetly in bathroom stalls. Laughter died out in the cafeteria. Even the hum of the centrifuges seemed haunted. But then, quietly, the first cracks in the silence appeared. One of the employees who couldn't look away was Tyler Schultz, the grandson of board member George Schultz, a former U.S. Secretary of State. Tyler had joined Theranos fresh out of college, idealistic and eager to make a difference. But what he saw inside those labs terrified him. The Edison devices were giving wildly inaccurate results, so bad that test patients were being told they were pregnant when they weren't, or that they had diseases they didn't. When Tyler tried to raise concerns with lab directors, he hit a wall. When he emailed Holmes directly, he was ignored. When he spoke to Balwani, he was threatened. One night, Tyler stayed late in the lab reviewing test data. He realized something horrifying. The company had begun using Edison machines on real patients through Walgreens clinics, knowing the results were unreliable. We weren't just lying to investors anymore. We were lying to people who trusted us with their lives. Tyler decided to act. He began collecting evidence, test logs, internal emails, calibration reports, each one a small crack in the wall of deception. But Sonny noticed. Security tightened. Legal threats followed. One afternoon, Tyler's phone buzzed with a message from HR. "You're being called to the executive floor." He knew it was over. The next day, his badge stopped working. He was escorted out of the building. But he didn't stop. He had one last card to play, and it was about to reach the desk of a journalist who would change everything. Some stories start with a dream. This one was about to end with a phone call.
In late 2014, the Wall Street Journal's newsroom was buzzing, but not with the usual market updates or tech IPO chatter. Somewhere in that crowded Manhattan office, a reporter named John Carreyrou had just received an email that would ignite one of the biggest scandals Silicon Valley had ever seen. The email was short, nervous, and unsigned. It came from someone claiming to have first-hand knowledge of a multi-billion-dollar medical fraud hiding behind a tech startup. At first, Carreyrou thought it might be another tip about a biotech exaggerating its progress. But then a name popped up, one that had become Silicon Valley royalty. Theranos. And right beside it, Elizabeth Holmes. The email alleged that Holmes's miracle blood testing device, the Edison, didn't actually work. It claimed that Theranos was using commercial analyzers for most tests, not its own invention. It even hinted that patients' lives might be at risk. Carreyrou leaned back in his chair, his mind racing. If this was true, it wasn't just a bad product. It was mass deception. He started making calls, quiet, careful ones. Former employees refused to speak. Those who did would only whisper. Some cried. Others warned him. They have lawyers, powerful ones. Theranos wasn't just another tech firm. It was backed by generals, senators, and billionaires. Its board included former secretaries of state like Henry Kissinger and George Shultz. Holmes had become the darling of Silicon Valley, often compared to Steve Jobs. She dressed in black turtlenecks, spoke in a deep, deliberate tone, and promised to revolutionize healthcare. So how could this all be fake? The deeper Carreyrou dug, the stranger it got. In Arizona and California, Walgreens clinics had already started offering Theranos blood tests. Patients were pricking their fingers, sending off samples, and receiving results that sometimes changed their lives or destroyed them. One woman was told she had a potential miscarriage. Another was falsely warned of cancer, all based on faulty data. Inside Theranos, the atmosphere had turned toxic. Employees were breaking down, some leaving in the middle of the night. And yet Holmes projected confidence. She appeared on magazine covers, smiling, the world's youngest self-made billionaire. Every TV appearance, every keynote speech, every glossy photo shoot was another brick in her empire of illusion. But behind the cameras, Holmes was panicking. Rumors had reached her. Someone was talking to the press, and she was ready to fight. When Holmes learned that the Wall Street Journal was investigating, she didn't call her PR team. She called her lawyers. Theranos unleashed David Boies, one of America's most feared attorneys, to crush the story before it even ran. Carreyrou received letters accusing him of defamation, warning him not to publish. His sources began to disappear. Phones went silent. Even Tyler Schultz, the whistleblower, was under siege. Private investigators followed him. His family was threatened with lawsuits. George Shultz, his own grandfather, begged him to back off, afraid that Elizabeth might be right after all. "She's convincing, Tyler," his grandfather said. "Maybe this is all just a misunderstanding." But Tyler knew the truth. He'd seen it. And now a journalist halfway across the country was about to put it all on the record. On October 15, 2015, the Wall Street Journal dropped the bombshell headline. Hot startup Theranos has struggled with his blood test technology. The exposé was damning. It revealed that most of the tests Theranos claimed to perform on its proprietary device were actually being run on conventional machines. It showed internal documents, whistleblower accounts, and scientific inconsistencies that shattered the company's credibility. In a single day, the myth began to crumble. News anchors read the story aloud on live television. Investors panicked. Doctors began questioning the accuracy of thousands of patient results. And yet, Holmes didn't blink. She went on television and smiled that same tight smile. Her calm confidence confused most people who thought her unruffled demeanor was innocence. But what they didn't know was that Holmes had mastered the art of deception. But inside Theranos, a massive storm was brewing, and Holmes was nothing but calm. Lawsuits were piling up, regulators were hovering, and somewhere in Washington, a quiet federal agency called CMS, the Centers for Medicare and Medicaid Services, was about to open an investigation that would rip the company open from the inside. The press had pulled the first thread, but they had no idea how fast the entire fabric would unravel. When the Wall Street Journal story hit, Silicon Valley gasped. But Elizabeth Holmes didn't flinch, at least not in public. She called an emergency meeting in the Theranos auditorium. Rows of anxious employees sat waiting, their faces pale, as Holmes walked in wearing her signature black turtleneck and an icy smile. This is what happens when you try to change the world. We are under attack, but we will fight. The room erupted in applause. But behind those smiles, no one really believed her anymore. They'd seen the data. They'd seen the chaos. And yet they clapped, because at Theranos, to stop clapping was to disappear. While Holmes was rallying her troops, CMS inspectors quietly walked in to Theranos' Newark lab. They weren't investors or journalists. They were scientists, and they wanted evidence. What they found was disturbing. Machines calibrated by hand, samples stored improperly, documents rewritten overnight to hide bad results. One inspector later described the lab as a place where science had been replaced by wishful thinking. CMS issued a 121-page report. It was devastating. The report declared that Theranos posed an immediate jeopardy to patient health and safety. They revoked the company's federal license. They banned Elizabeth Holmes and Sunny Bolvani from owning or operating a lab for 2 years. To any rational founder, that would have been the end. But Elizabeth Holmes wasn't rational. She went on national television and smiled. We made mistakes, but we're correcting them. Theranos is still strong. The reality? Her empire was disintegrating. By mid-2016, Walgreens terminated their partnership. Safeway, once preparing to roll out Theranos clinics nationwide, backed out. Investors started calling their lawyers. Holmes's board, a collection of old men who once saw her as the next Steve Jobs, now avoided her calls. Her net worth, once estimated at $4.5 billion, fell to zero overnight. But the illusion had gone too far to stop cleanly. Theranos had dozens of lawsuits pending. Federal prosecutors were watching closely. And inside the company, paranoia reached its peak. Employees were required to sign new NDAs. Hard drives vanished. Lab notebooks were shredded. Those who dared to speak to regulators found themselves followed, intimidated, even sued. Holmes moved through the chaos like a ghost, calm, cold, and detached. She kept giving interviews, still speaking of her dream. "This is not the end," she said to a reporter. "This is just another beginning." But even her voice, once steady and hypnotic, now cracked under the weight of delusion. In 2018, after years of investigation, the U.S. Department of Justice finally acted. Elizabeth Holmes and Ramesh Balvani were charged with multiple counts of wire fraud and conspiracy to commit wire fraud. The indictment claimed they had intentionally misled investors, doctors, and patients, knowing full well that their technology didn't work. Each charge carried the potential for 20 years in prison. Elizabeth Holmes pled not guilty. Her defense? She hadn't meant to deceive anyone. She truly believed in her vision. But prosecutors had emails, data, witnesses, and something even more damning: testimonies from inside Theranos itself. The whistleblowers spoke of fake demos, of data cherry-picked to look clean, of executives pressured to lie. And the jury listened, spellbound, horrified. The trial of Elizabeth Holmes became a media circus. Outside the courthouse, cameras lined the sidewalks. Reporters compared her to everyone from Steve Jobs to Bernie Madoff. Inside, Holmes sat expressionless, often flanked by her new fiancé. Her lawyers painted her as naive, idealistic, manipulated by Sunny Balvani. But the evidence said otherwise. Her emails to investors read like a masterclass in deception. Her public statements were rehearsed, deliberate, designed to seduce trust.
CMS later concluded that Theranos had put patients in immediate jeopardy. And then came the hammer blow. The government banned Elizabeth Holmes from owning or operating a lab for 2 years. 2 years. That was the official ruling. But unofficially, it was the beginning of the end. Theranos had lost its credibility, its partners, and its core technology. Walgreens terminated its deal. Safeway quietly wrote off its investment. The once $9 billion company now had nothing left but lawsuits and shattered promises. Yet Holmes, ever the performer, refused to surrender. She doubled down, pitching new investors, promising new machines, and giving new interviews. She even wore the same black turtleneck, still quoting Steve Jobs, still talking about changing the world. But by 2016, the illusion was dead. Theranos shut down its labs and testing centers. Its board members, once untouchable, resigned one by one. And behind the scenes, prosecutors were preparing something even more devastating: a criminal investigation. When it finally came, it was brutal. Elizabeth Holmes and Ramesh Sunny Balwani, her secret lever and COO, were charged with wire fraud, conspiracy, and misleading investors and patients. The case accused them of running a scheme to defraud hundreds of millions of dollars from investors, all while endangering lives through faulty tests. Theranos, the empire built on a single drop of blood, had finally bled out. But the story wasn't over yet. In the courtroom, the world watched as Elizabeth, once called the next Steve Jobs, faced her reckoning. Her defense painted her as a visionary undone by ambition, a young woman crushed by Silicon Valley's culture of hype. The prosecution, meanwhile, showed her as a master manipulator, someone who lied, threatened, and charmed her way into a billion-dollar fraud. Witnesses took the stand. Former employees broke down in tears. Investors, humiliated, described being deceived by charisma and fake demos. Emails and text messages between Holmes and Balwani revealed the truth. They both knew the tests didn't work, and they kept selling them anyway. Holmes sat silently, her face blank, her once famous baritone voice replaced by a soft whisper. The black turtleneck was gone, replaced by a courtroom suit. The aura of genius had vanished. When the verdict came, it was almost poetic. Guilty, on 4 counts of fraud and conspiracy. As she stood there, silent and still, it was hard not to think about how far she had fallen, from the youngest self-made female billionaire to a convicted felon. Her empire had been built on blood. Not the kind that saves lives, but the kind spilled in pursuit of power and fame. And as the gavel fell, the myth of Theranos crumbled completely. But the story still haunts Silicon Valley. Because deep down, everyone knew Theranos wasn't just one woman's crime. It was a mirror held up to a culture obsessed with disruption, a world where charisma outweighs truth, and where investors chase dreams faster than they verify facts. The lesson? In a world built on hype, sometimes the biggest lie is the one everyone wants to believe. When the smoke cleared and the cameras finally turned away from the courtroom, Silicon Valley pretended to move on. But the truth? The ghost of Theranos roamed and never really left. The story lingered in boardrooms, in startup pitch decks, in the uneasy silence between venture capitalists who'd once sworn they'd do more due diligence next time. Elizabeth Holmes had become both a cautionary tale and a cultural icon, a symbol of ambition unmoored from ethics. Some people pitied her, others despised her. But everyone, investors, entrepreneurs, journalists, had to ask themselves one uncomfortable question. How did we let this happen? This was the story of Theranos, the blood test that lied. Up next is another mind-boggling story that would keep you on the edge of your seat, squirming in excitement. Like and subscribe to catch all the gist and to receive instant notifications once the next post goes live.